Here we are back at this exciting and extremely intriguing subject matter, which is that clothes matter. They really do. And they speak a language. And as my introduction has been to this entire setup, is that we have no choice but to take clothing as a serious nonverbal communication. Clothing can provide important information about the sex, age, occupation, origin, sexual appetites and personality, attitudes, and the values of the wearer. Now, clothes can be signs of social status, position, power, and in most societies is very evident in the role clothes play. As individuals attempt to bridge different worlds, they are constantly dressing and subsequently undressing, assuming and then casting aside those identities. We're going to discuss a crazy story that's kind of shoehorned right into the story of Joseph. And it's in the last part of chapters of Genesis, and it's in chapter 38. And it is when Tamar confronts her father-in-law, Judah. And what this is about is that masks can reveal more than they conceal about us. And this is about whether or not we have the power and will to see ourselves clothed in righteousness and honesty instead of only seeing ourselves in the trappings of success. Okay? And so masks can certainly reveal more than what they can identify. Now, you have to understand, just for a backdrop, the Levirate law is that if a woman was married to a man and he died and they had no kids, she was married to her next of kin, or the brother, or the next of kin down. And so there's a lot to be said about Tamar dressed as the harlot, but one must ask the question, had Tamar had a sense of understanding and her leadership would have dealt equitably with her, would have she ever been out there playing the harlot in the first place? And the answer to that is absolutely not. During that time, Judah, the most powerful of Jacob's sons, who could have saved Joseph's life at the pit, he did not, and he's an internal whirlwind of grief and regret, and he distanced himself from the family. Now, he goes out and one of his sons dies, and so he's supposed to get, she's supposed to marry another one, and then he says, well, man, if she marries, I guess he's, kind of superstitious. If she marries him, then, my youngest is going to die. And so this woman's just a bad deal. So he deceives his daughter-in-law, and he will not fulfill his responsibility. So in chapter 38 and verse number 11, then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah, my son, be grown. For he said, lest peradventure he die also, as his two brothers did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. And so then in the process of time, Judah's wife dies. And so he's mourning her, and Judah was comforted and went up into the sheep shears at Timnath, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And so they're going to go up there, and so he's very clear that what he did is he convinced himself at the justice of his decision. Because he had given very little thought to Tamar from that day forward, he really believed that his treatment of Tamar was justified because it saved his young son's life in his estimation. Perhaps knowing that we've done something like this, in most cases these involve minor issues, and we label them as excuses, stories, or just necessary things. We believe that we would never hurt anybody. Therefore, the hurt that we did cause them doesn't count because we don't believe that we willingly or intentionally hurt them. We wear this false perception as a mask that camouflages the hurt we cause. Yet let us learn from Judah's case, because as a result of deceiving Tamar, he lost something of himself. Okay, so he's going and he's going to go up to the road Timnath, and so, but perhaps at Timnah, Judah himself would be uncovered, the mask of respectability removed, so that he would have to face his true self. Sometimes we use the trappings of success to ignore who we really are, the struggles and the identity crisis that we're going through. And it's a real deal. People just buy stuff, binge buy stuff. And when they feel empty and cardboard and hollowed out, well, the answer to that is go buy stuff. And so there's a whole series that we could do on this. But what happens is Tamar takes off her garments of mourning and puts on a veil of colorful garments. She sits alone at the crossroads waiting for Judah. She wrapped herself in courage and strength and fortified herself for what he had to be done. She had changed, and she was no longer a young, naive girl, but she had taken it into her own hands. Now, the place, which means literally in the Hebrew word eyes or opening of the eyes. The place's name only serves to show the disguise that is used to reveal her situation and redress it. Unmasking herself, she intended to unmask Judah, to remove the superficial, the self-righteous cover to his true identity. Now, Tamar heard that her father-in-law was going up to the party, and it was like, he's going to the fair, and this is the way that it worked. They would go, and at the sheep shears deal, there would be prostitutes there. There would be all kinds of festivities. And so his friend says, man, come on, you're a widower, you're lonely. Let's go up to the sheep shears, festival, and let's hoop it up for a little bit. And so he goes up there with the intention, he's going to get himself a girl. He's going to uncover someone's nakedness. Little does he know that he actually is going to uncover his own deceit. And so he goes up and he says, he sees this woman, and she puts a veil and wrapped herself and sat in an open place, which is by the way of Timnath. For she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given unto him as wife. Verse 15, when Judah saw her, he thought her to be a harlot because she had covered her face. Now, the truth of the matter is, he sees this Canaanite harlot sitting by the way. He couldn't see that it was his daughter-in-law. Now, let's talk brass tacks and honesty here. Had she been completely sitting there bareheaded with no veil on, he wouldn't have recognized her. And the reason he wouldn't have recognized her is because he was so self-absorbed. Truth be told, he wouldn't have recognized her because he never paid any attention to her anyway. Never really coming to know her as a person. He saw nothing, even though she spent time in his presence. This is something all of us have to deal with. But knowing ourselves, how can we be very critical of Judah when we too have spent many times in the presence of people and not got to know them? You ever talk to somebody who, while they're talking to you, they're actually not listening to you? They're thinking of the next smart thing to say. They're not really engaged in a relationship. They're not really trying. You have couples that say, we're going to stay home, and they sit home and watch something all night together. Don't talk. They don't explore each other's creativity or emotions. They'll ride down a road for hours looking at Instagram or Facebook or whatever it is. Anything to be together alone. And this is the way that Judah was. And this even pertains to those whom we presume to love. We convince ourselves that we are spending quality time with someone close to us, building relationships, getting to know each other, but really we're thousands of miles apart, immersed in our own thoughts and selves, and are oblivious to the other. Truly seeing another person takes work and commitment on our part and a conscious attempt to really pay attention to what is important. Judah wouldn't have known her anyway. So like Judah, who only recognized the garments of a prostitute sitting by the wayside, we are taken by the masks that people wear. We are fooled easily. We are deceived quickly. External trappings that seem to fit them, their success, wealth, luxuries, and friends. But in contrast, Tamar saw Judah, but she saw through Judah as well. She saw the truth. She understood he had no intention of ever allowing her to marry his son, and that she was destined to sit as a widow for the rest of her life. Judah comes to her and he says, hey, listen, I lust for you. I desire you. Here's the problem. I don't have anything to give. He said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll send you a kid from the flock, and you'll give me a pledge. She knows he's a liar. She's been lied to twice by him. She's been fooled by him twice. She knows he's not going to give that kid. She knows he's not going to pay his debt. He hasn't been a father-in-law to her. You think he's going to be an honest and upright patron to a harlot? She knows exactly what he is, and more importantly, she knows what he isn't. He says, well, okay, what pledge do I give you? Verse 18 of Genesis 38. She says, give me your signet. That's the ring they wore that they stamped in the clay. That was their formal ambassadorial and official stamp. That's like the version of having someone's identity or credit card or power of attorney. She says, give me your signet ring. Give me your Amex card. Give me your suit jacket, and give me your car. I want your mantle. I want your signet ring, and I want your staff. Verse 18, and he gave it her. And he came unto her, and she conceived by him. She rose away and went and laid her veil by her and put on the garments of her widowhood. Judah sent the kid by the hand of his friend, the Adullamite, to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he couldn't find her. Where's the woman? His friend asked, hey, there was a harlot here the other day. And people's like, what? There's not a harlot here. What are you talking about? No, really, there was. I have this friend. His name is Judah. He's a very powerful man, and he couldn't pay. And he gave her a staff and a signet ring and his mantle. He took off his royal jacket. He took off his staff. He gave her his identity. See, she knew him. And her desire was to strip him of all of the trappings of success that helped him deny the inner core questions of who he was, and more importantly, who he wasn't. And so they asked the men of that place, where's the harlot? Returned to Judah. He said, I cannot find her. And the men of the place, verse 22, said that there's never been a harlot here. And Judah said, let her take it to her, lest we be ashamed. Behold, I sent this kid, and thou hast not found her. In other words, whatever's whatever. Now, about 3 months later, this is where it gets powerful. Recognizing oneself without the props is the hardest task you'll ever do. And clothes and props. See, I'm talking about more than just clothes. I'm talking about more than a jacket, a sweater, a necktie. I'm talking about infinitely more. I'm talking about all the things, the trappings that people need in order to feel like they are who they are. Can you recognize yourself without your stuff? And so what this really, really is truly about is about surviving the loss of position and status. What happens when one's identity is no longer there? What do I say? What do I do? And how do I act? And this is an important key. Okay? Because as we move through this and we realize and understand that it's not nearly as easy as one would assume. This is about whether or not we have the power and will to see ourselves clothed in righteousness. Am I the whole man that I need to be, even if I don't have all my stuff? Is righteousness alone enough to give me a sense of validation? Is it affirmation enough, or do I need all the trappings? I'm going to tell you a funny story here in a minute. And so Can I live a full and substantive life without the props? Judah comes back in, and they come to him and they say, hey, Pops, your daughter-in-law is pregnant. The one that's was supposed to marry the widow of my first two, and the one who's supposed to marry Shelah? Yeah. Okay. So he takes her, and he says, behold, she is with child by whoredom. Verse 24, Judah says, bring her here and let her be burnt. This is unbelievable. Okay? So she gets brought in. She goes to her father-in-law, and she says, upon hearing that his daughter-in-law is pregnant, he's so furious, he said, let's kill her. And she says, I am by child, by the man who owns these objects. Verse 25. She was brought forth. She said, by the man who these are, am I with child. Now, guys, listen to this. This is staggering, okay? She says, discern, I pray thee. Whose are these? The signet, the bracelets, and the staff. Who owns these objects? Whose stuff is this? That's the man that is the father of these children. Now, go back to chapter 37 and look at verse number 32, where they go, the sons go, and they go in, they have this blood-drenched coat, and they give it to Jacob, and they say unto him that sent the coat, verse 32, they sent the coat of many colors, they brought it to their father, and said, this have we found, know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. In the Hebrew, it basically translates, recognize, please, is this your son's tunic or not? Recognize, please, is this your son's or not? Crazy, ironic, prophetic, and brilliant. She repeats the words that he used to trick his father back to him. And she says this, recognize, please, the seal, the mantle, the staff. At that moment, Judah was forced to recognize the injustice of his actions. All of his actions, starting with the sale of his brother and then the deep pain he caused Jacob and now Tamar. As he stares at the seal, the mantle, the staff, the most important symbols of his world and who he was, or at least ought to have been, and perhaps for the very first time in his life, he took a real look at himself. Finally, the Bible says, in verse number 26, and Judah recognized them. And Judah acknowledged them. And said, she hath been more righteous than me. Having lost all that defined him, all the world's things and symbols that he had put behind and forced to recognize his own lack of righteousness. In this recognition, he becomes a leader. He becomes righteous when he states, Tamar is more righteous than I, and so much that I did not give my son to her. This was the turning point for Judah. He took the first step toward essential personal change and greater wholeness in his life. He recognized, I have hid behind the props. She's more righteous than I am. He sees that his stuff is in front of him, and he still recognizes that he can be clothed in righteousness. He doesn't need the signet. He doesn't need the stuff. He doesn't need all the brands. He doesn't need to drip the swag. Come on, listen to me now. He doesn't need all of that garbage that you buy and all that plastic stuff. He doesn't need the fakes, and he doesn't need the bling. He stands there, naked of his status symbols, and says, she is more righteous than me. He doesn't go for the props. He goes for the righteousness. So here's the thing. Asonius was a brilliant man and back in the day. And so there was a rich man that could afford to buy books, and he just bought books and bought books. and he had a library. And they were making fun of him, and they said, what will you do after this? Because you can afford to buy all these books and put them on your shelf, and you don't read them and you don't study them. After this, will you also buy strings of lyres, and will you also fancy yourself a musician because you can put the props together? I had a man in my office not long ago, and my library is truly a working reference library. It's my work world, right? And so I have a lot of books in there and a lot of valuable things, and I've read them and I read them and I refer to them, and it's a working reference library. It really, really is. And he walks around and he says, this is really nice. He said, I keep all my books at home. He said, but coming here and looking at this, he said, I should have an office at the church with all my books. He said, this would be great props. People would come in here and really think you were smart. And I just froze because, it's appalling to me. How in the world do you think that this life of learning, this indulgence into learning history and applying the theorems that are learned and work, how do you think this is props to make someone? Okay, so in my library, I don't do counseling in my library. I'll meet them at the coffee shop or in the conference small hall, or I'll meet them. I've met them in here in the studio. Okay, why? Because what books are to an uneducated man, a Rolls Royce is to a poor man. They're immediately thrown off by the props, right? So to me, if I have any wisdom, if I have any strength and force of argument or idea, let it come because of the nature of my heart, my love for learning. Don't come in and gauge me because of the props, because of what you see. So my library serves as like this private inner sanctum where I go to just read quietly alone and give my life to study, right? And so I have a stand-up desk in there that never gets cleaned. It's all my Bibles, it's all my notebooks, it's all my pens, and then underneath of that is any of the reference books that I'm working on teaching that. So I don't even think in my world, to me it's like a workshop. And my stand-up desk is like a workman's bench, and I'm standing there working my way through the text and working my way through the Bible and doing the work of it, putting the notes in my margins and doing all that. And I'm not really studying to preach. I haven't studied to preach in years and years and years. I study to know Him. And from that just comes messages. And so instead of getting this Saturday night special where you're like, oh God, tomorrow morning, Sunday, what do I say? It's just like, Lord, your word is rich. It's mountains of gold. It's beautiful. We've mined the riches of your revelation. What don't I say? What should I narrow down and say? So it's not props, right? But people that walk in, they want to gauge you by what the props are. And so you see this in Judah right here, is he does something that is remarkable. For all the things that he is not, the one thing this man does, and he does powerfully, is he humbles himself in this moment and he says, I'm going to wean myself from the props and I'm going to attempt to clothe myself in righteousness. Okay? So having lost all that defined him and all the world's things, the symbols, all of that he puts behind and he's forced to recognize, and the recognition in that he becomes a leader. This was a turning point for Judah. He took the first step toward the essential personal change and greater wholeness in his life. His relationship with his Canaanite daughter-in-law led him back to his brothers, his family, and his higher self to achieve that he had to give his own clothes and symbols of power and all that previously defined him to Tamar. But in return, you know what he got for this? This is shocking. In return, he actually got into the Davidic line. Because of who he was, and because of this moment when he repudiated all the tricks, trappings, all the symbols of success, they would trace the line of the Messiah through him. Tamar had twins in her. And one of those twins that Tamar gave birth to was a man named Perez. Perez, who was the first person mentioned in the Davidic genealogy in Ruth chapter 4, 18 through 22. Judah, Tamar, and this unbelievable story, weird story, becomes the very impetus of the great power of the Messiah to take broken, shattered things and loss of worldly symbols and worldly class status symbols and create a line of righteousness. And here's what we have to ask ourselves in this. Do we have the capacity to see ourselves honestly? Honestly, as Judah came to recognize himself? Will people eventually be able to say about us that we indeed recognize who we are and understand how we might be better than who we are? Will they ever say to us that he saw himself without the trappings of success and he sought righteousness? And she sought to clothe herself with godliness and was not satisfied with the symbols and the props. And this story really tells us about the glory of when God asks us to give up all of our stuff in order to deal with our own deceitful natures. Judah, we've talked about all these other people. Esau, Jacob. Jacob tries to deceive his father, but Judah deceived himself until the moment he was unclothed and he was stripped of his status symbols. And when this happened, he recognized how truly naked that he was. I'm reminded of Jesus' words in the book of Revelation, where Jesus confronts the church, who assumes that they have nothing left to learn for, to go for. He says unto them, he talks to them and says, look, you're doing great. And there's many people that know much about you. And you're doing a wonderful thing. And a lot of people are impressed with you. But I know thy works. Thou art neither hot nor cold nor hot. So then because thou art lukewarm, he says, you say, Revelation chapter 3, verse 17, you say I am rich. I am increased with goods. I have need of nothing. And you know not that thou art wretched, miserable, and poor, and blind, and naked. There is a vast difference between someone's true wealth. They're not rich in faith. They're rich and increased with goods. And they assume that because gain is in their life, then that is indicative of godliness. Judah had lived all of his life with the props. What did he have to worry about? What, he could treat people any way he wanted. He was the heir apparent. He had the signet ring. He had the staff. He had the mantle. He was the man. But in this moment, when he had this great confrontation with self, he said, I'm rich. I'm increased with goods. I don't need anything. And the Lord spoke back to him through the revelation of his own wretched life and said, you do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel of thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, and have white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, that the shame of thy nakedness do not appear. And I will anoint thine eyes with eye salve, that thou mayest see. This is exactly what God did for Judah. He anointed his eyes with eye salve. And when Judah saw his own misery, he saw his own patheticness, he leapt at the opportunity to buy wisdom and to buy righteousness and to buy godliness. Gold tried in the fire, that he could be rich. He wanted his white raiment. He wanted to be clothed again. He wanted the shame of his nakedness to disappear. And when he did this, this single act of contrition, this single act of self-effacing honesty, God said, I will put you in the lineage of the Messiah, because all that are in that lineage must repudiate the status symbols of the world and realize there is a wealth from another world that you could get, but you have to renounce the things of this life. He that lose his life shall find it. And this is the message of the gospel. Remember, clothes matter. Perception of what we think our value is, all of that matters. And I want God to clothe me with his glory and his righteousness. Stay clothed in the meekness and the glory of God.